Oh Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes Benz? My friends all drive Porsches, I must make amends. Worked hard all my lifetime, no help from my friends. So oh Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes Benz? Oh Lord, won't you buy me a color TV? Dialing $4 is trying to find me. I wait for delivery each day until 3. So, oh Lord, won't you buy me a color TV?
The sin of gluttony is the sin that tells you you're never going to be enough, you're never going to have enough. Whereas greed says if you just have more, you're going to be happy, you're going to be peaceful, you'll find contentment. Gluttony says, no, those things are never going to happen for you because you'll never have enough. You'll never be enough. We see the power of sin, the power of gluttony in the wilderness story. Now, we've already been in the wilderness, of course. We know the story of Moses with the staff beating the rock, the power of wrath where God decommissioned him. It was the whole pomegranate fiasco. But I want to take you back to 40 years before this. The Hebrew people have just crossed through the Red Sea. For the first time in their history, they are free. They don't have to worry about Pharaoh or Egypt or their slave masters ever again. Of course, they begin to celebrate. Unfortunately, the celebration does not take very long. The party stops very soon because the Hebrew people have a concern. They have lots of concerns in the wilderness, but one of their very first concerns is this: Moses, what are we going to do for food? We're hungry. We don't have any food, which of course is not true. The Hebrew people had plenty of food. When they left Egypt, they brought supplies with them. They still have those supplies. In addition, the Bible makes it abundantly clear they have livestock, which means they have food for months. Still, they're worried about what's going to happen when their provisions run out. This isn't going to be enough. Remember, that's what gluttony whispers over and over again to us. The Hebrew people are wondering, are we going to have enough? So they turn to Moses. Moses turns to God, and God makes this glorious promise. God says, tomorrow, when you wake up, you're going to find that I have rained manna down from heaven. It will be enough. Now, when we imagine this story, we often think of some heavenly bakery that floats down these beautiful loaves of fresh made bread that the Hebrew people wake up every morning, unzip their tents, go out and crack open a fresh loaf of bread, butter it heavily, and eat to their delight. And that's actually not what happened. You see, manna is this flaky white substance that the Hebrew people would gather together, and it became the main ingredient in forming this flat bread of sorts. Now, to be clear, a manna does not taste like what you would buy at the local bakery. Trust me, it's not great. At the same time, it's enough. It was enough to sustain the Hebrew people for 40 years in the wilderness. The Hebrew people received this glorious gift, but it's not just a gift. It's also a test. You see, God gave the Hebrew people enough manna as long as everybody shared. If one person goes out and says, I'm going to take 3 to 4 times what I need, that meant 3 or 4 people in the community would go hungry. If someone else gathered enough and said, well, I'm going to make some for today and some for the next few days, that manna would spoil and other people would be hungry. What the Hebrew people were being conditioned to do is to share with one another, to be generous with one another. The Hebrew people are in the wilderness for 40 years. You should understand this. It's only 400 miles from Israel to Egypt. To be clear, walking from Egypt to Israel, 400 miles, that's a long journey, but it doesn't take 40 years. If you do the math, that means the Hebrew people on average traveled only 150 feet per day. Obviously, there's something else going on in the wilderness. It's not about getting from point A to point B. It's about God conditioning the Hebrew people to be generous with one another, to know that the sin of gluttony has no power in their life, that the promise of God, it's always enough. That is the virtue that helps us ward off the sin of gluttony. Because let's be honest, the sin of gluttony, it's everywhere. We often associate the sin of gluttony with overeating, and to be sure, that is the case. How many of us haven't grabbed a few extra chocolate chip cookies when we're feeling down about ourselves? Maybe we've made a mistake. Maybe we feel like we're a failure, and we think that the grace and forgiveness of God, it just isn't enough. So what do? We just pound those chocolate chip cookies or something else to help take away the sting of that feeling. But to be clear, gluttony works in other ways as well. It's not just through food. A person who looks in the mirror and thinks she's less than a child of God, that she's not good enough, who instead turns not to food, but to exercise, to vigorous dieting in a hopes of someday thinking maybe if she could just do better or look better, then she would be worthy of God's love, but it's never enough. That's also the sin of gluttony. Just like the person who turns to his financial statements, who thinks over and over again, I can't find peace, I can't find comfort, turns to that financial statement, looking at it, thinking maybe, just maybe, and yet it's never enough. Friends, gluttony works through all sorts of food, or all sorts of things. It can be through food, it can be through money, it can be through exercise, it can be through a host of things. Anything in life that we turn to when we hear that voice that says, you're not enough, you'll never have enough, that's the sin of gluttony working in our lives. But the virtue that we hear about in the wilderness journey that helps us combat that sin, it is the virtue of generosity. It's what the Hebrew people spent 40 years, 14,000 days plus learning, to be generous with one another, because that's what God's people are called to do, to ward off the sin of gluttony. So the question is, if you want to be a person who is free from the sin of gluttony, if you want to be a person who's generous, I have 3 questions for you. And that is, start with number 1. Are you being generous with your words? There was this interesting experiment done about 100 years ago by a researcher. She did this experiment on 4th, 5th, and 6th graders. And to be clear, you could never repeat this experiment today for good reason. But what she did is she gathered all of these teachers together, and they had very specific instructions. All of these 4th, 5th, and 6th graders were put into different groups. They were all given math tests, but the first group was given nothing but negative feedback. It didn't matter how well they had done the test. They might have gotten the highest score of all the 4th graders, but they were told it's not enough. You are in danger of falling behind. I can't believe you would make this mistake. You should be better than this. The second group was given no feedback whatsoever. The third group was given positive feedback. Again, it didn't matter what their scores were. Even if they were really low, they were told, oh, you're doing great. You're really improving. You're onto something. You did a great job showing your work here. Again, negative, none, and positive feedback. What they found over the course of months as these groups stayed together, as they were given the same type of feedback over and over again, is that the negative group initially spiked. It's like someone said, you're not good enough, you need to rise to the challenge, and so they did, initially. But after a few weeks for some of the students and a couple of months for the rest of the students, they eventually went back to the point where over the course of the year, their scores essentially were the same as when they started. The second group, which was given no feedback, their scores increased just a little bit as they became more familiar with the territory, but there wasn't, or with the testing material, but it wasn't a steep incline by any stretch of the imagination. And last but not least was this positive group. This positive group who was, no matter how well they did, they were told they were on the right track, they were doing well. What happened to them? Rather predictably, their test scores grew and grew and grew. There's a steady incline. Why? Because words matter. Words matter. They affect us. They have power in our lives. So the question is, are you being generous with your words? Are you using your words on a daily basis to be a blessing to the people around you, or are you keeping those words to yourself? That's the first question. Am I being generous with my words? The second question is this: am I being generous with my emotions? There's a beautiful moment in a funeral I attended fairly recently, where a middle-aged man stood up and he talked about the transformation that had happened in his family as they mourned the death of his brother. And he said, I have said I love you in the last 6 months more times than in the last 50 years combined. When we share of ourselves, when we share of our emotions, it transforms us. Are we being generous with those things? I grew up in a household, my father grew up in a household, that they weren't super touchy-feely. German people in southern Iowa, German heritage, that's just not part of the DNA. So in high school, For reasons I don't quite remember, I started giving my father a hug periodically, and I would always say, "I love you, Dad." And my dad didn't always know how to respond to this, so he would always say, "Same here, bud." And perhaps because his face would turn a little red, perhaps because it made him uncomfortable, I would go out of my way to do this. I just enjoyed how uncomfortable my father was made to feel by these words, by these acts of love. It wasn't until I was in my mid-20s that one day I said to my dad, gave him a hug, and I said, "I love you, Dad," and he paused, and I could tell he was getting ready to say something, and then he said, "I love you too, bud." Said it about as fast as he possibly could. He reached over, he gave me a quick hug, and walked away. Now, please understand, I've always known my father loves me. From the time I was born, through his actions, I've always known that I am loved by my father. But I have to tell you something. In that moment, it felt incredible. There is something about when we go out of our way to show our emotions, to share our emotions with the people around us. So are you being generous with your emotions? Are you being generous with your words? Are you being generous with your emotions? And finally, are you being generous with your stuff? Please understand, I'm not sharing this story as a pastor who's trying to raise money for his congregation. That's not the point of these videos. What I'm telling you as a person, and as one of many who's already discovered this, as a person who wrestles with gluttony myself, what I have found is that being generous with my stuff. In my case, that means for our family that we give away a portion of our income that makes a difference in our daily lives. Now, that probably seems counterintuitive. If I am a person who struggles with gluttony, who always thinks I don't have enough, giving stuff away seems to be, again, it seems to be counterintuitive. And yet, when I do this, it helps me keep things in perspective. It helps for me to know that gluttony doesn't have power in my life, to become generous. So that's the question I would ask you, those three questions. Am I being generous with my words? Am I being generous with my emotions? And am I being generous with my stuff? As you wrestle with these questions, I invite you to remember what the Hebrew people discovered in the wilderness, and that is this. Thanks to the faithfulness of God, you already have enough. The Hebrew people discovered this by sharing their manna, by sharing themselves, by sharing their words of affirmation with one another through the course of 40 years. They learned that the promise of God, it's always enough. Again, thank you for joining us. Have a great discussion.
Oh Lord, won't you buy me a night on the town? I'm counting on you, Lord. Please don't let me down. Prove that you love me and buy the next round. Oh Lord, won't you buy me a night on the town? Oh Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes Benz? My friends all drive Porsches. I must make amends. Worked hard all my lifetime, no help from my friends. So, Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes Benz?
Whoa, whoa, whoa. Before you go off into your small groups and have conversation, just wanted a quick stop and say thank you. Thank you for being a part of this new ministry at United Lutheran Church. We have been so excited about it, and it has gone really well. We're just happy to hear all of the good reports from loops all around town. It has been just amazing and wonderful, and thank you. And we look forward to doing it again. We're going to take a break now through December and January, and we start up with brand new loops in February. So we look forward to that, but enough of me talking. Now it's time for you. Turn towards each other and have meaningful conversation about things that matter. Thank you.